Among the countless criminal cases, some stand out more than others. The death of Caroline and Dickinson in 1996 is one of those stories completely unusual in itself. It also became the emblematic turning point regarding the use of genetic engineering in forensic analysis in France. But this only happened because of the tireless struggle of a father outraged by the murder of his teenage daughter. A chilling account that will show us once again how our children can be in danger where they should be safe. I'm Marcos Campos. Welcome. If you enjoy real stories, subscribe and follow the channel. There are at least 3 new episodes every week and sometimes extra ones too. Join our members club if you can. It directly supports our productions. If not, that's fine. Just leave a like and a comment, and that will already be a big help for the channel, alright? Message received, let's state the facts. In 1996, Caroline Ann Dickinson lived with her mother, Susan Dickinson, a 38-year-old divorced nurse, and also with her 11-year-old sister, Jenny. The girl was an excellent student at Launceston College over in England, and she will always be remembered for her love of arts and music, activities to which she dedicated herself with great talent. Even as a teenager, Caroline was very skinny, very shy, and her best friend was her sister. In other words, her relationships at school were superficial, the girls in her class were nothing more than schoolmates. Her father, John Dickinson, at 39 years old, worked for the North Cornwall District Council, and his job was related to environmental protection. Very well, a happy family that was providing an excellent academic foundation for their daughters and also investing in their personal development. That's why Susan Dickinson, the mother, allowed her daughter to take part in this international trip organized by the school. There would be 40 students and 5 teachers on a trip to France. It was a great opportunity for Caroline to mature. And, as expected, being a concerned mother, Susan had a private talk with one of her daughter's teachers and asked her to keep an eye on the girl, because it would be Caroline's first trip alone, without her parents. In fact, it was the first and last trip for the teenager who returned to her country in a coffin. Bad luck, fate, or negligence. The Brittany region, which is in the west of France, was once home to immigrants from Great Britain, England. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So, this was the place chosen for the trip of the children from the English school Launceston College. On the 17th, the last day of her life, Caroline went, along with the other students and teachers, to visit Mont Saint-Michel, which is a very famous and beautiful tourist spot, as you can see here. Caroline stayed at a youth hostel set up in an old train station in room number 4 on the first floor. And she stayed there with 4 other girls. And that night, before going to sleep, the teenagers chatted excitedly and admired the starry sky, which was clearly visible there on summer nights. They even sang a children's song called Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, which I think everyone knows because it's universal, right? In the early hours of July 17th to 18th, 1996, according to the later testimony of 2 of the 4 girls who shared the room with Caroline, they heard moans and thumping sounds and saw her moving inside the sleeping bag on the floor. However, they did nothing. The girls went back to sleep, concluding that their roommate was just suddenly having a nightmare. Amy White, who was a companion on the trip to Brittany in July 1996, was sleeping in a dormitory across from the one where the crime happened. She was a witness at the trial of the man accused of killing Caroline and reported that she had an encounter with a strange, unfriendly-looking man when she and 2 classmates went to the bathroom that day at the hostel earlier that very night when everything happened. The man was between 30 and 40 years old, according to her. He had long, messy hair and also looked very sloppy with his thick and distinctive eyebrows, she said. The man said something that they didn't quite understand. Then he chuckled quietly to himself and walked down the stairs away from them. The girls then simply continued what they were doing and later went to sleep. The investigators on the case, upon collecting statements from everyone who was in the house, learned that one of the teachers heard footsteps going toward room number 4 on the first floor around 4 o'clock in the morning and again on the gravel sidewalk, leaving around 4:45 in the morning. And in light of this fact just mentioned, it's impossible not to reflect on it, and I invite you all to think about it as well. Look, 40 students, all minors, and under the responsibility of 5 adults. One of these adults hears footsteps at 4 in the morning when everyone should be asleep and doesn't go check what's happening. What was going on? Pretty suspicious, isn't it? You know what else the police found out? That the door to the property was permanently unlocked. This was supposedly in accordance with the French law regarding fires. In other words, an escape route in case of an accidental fire in the property, or a non-accidental one as well, right? And forgive us if you think differently, but this is really stupid, isn't it? In another criminal case from the same country, we found very similar circumstances. However, the victim was a 9-year-old boy, Jonathan Collum. So unfortunately, guys, these school events were a real feast for all kinds of predators. This thing about laws that determine certain things, it's just like trying to cover the sun with a sieve, right? You stare fixedly at one problem and forget all the others, which can even arise as a result of the one you just put a band-aid on. It's complicated, isn't it? Well, lots of kids, not enough supervisors. People constantly coming and going, big hostels, and doors open 24 hours a day. A place without surveillance camera technology or any other security systems. As I said before, it's the perfect chance for a predator to strike, isn't it? But getting back to the story, when Caroline's body was found, revealing the violent crime that had taken her life, the forensic team and the medical examiner methodically carried out the necessary examinations to identify those responsible. The evidence indicated that the girl had fought hard against her attacker and that he or they had suffocated her with a wad of cotton that was placed inside her mouth like a gag or a silencer. Well, after these preliminary investigations, Caroline's body was repatriated and a few days later, her funeral took place at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in the city of Cornwall, her hometown in England. There were no eyewitnesses. The classmates and a teacher provided information that was relevant to the investigation and at the same time frightening. When you think that the criminal could be someone from the group or even from the hostel itself. Or could it be, I wonder, that a stranger could be so absurdly bold to this extent? To break into the dormitory, rape and murder a teenager while her witnesses slept right next to her? Well, guys, the police obviously collected DNA samples from the girl's clothes, so initially these samples were compared with the genetic material of all the students, teachers, and staff at the hostel, and then also with the residents of that city. A slow, expensive job that unfortunately did not identify the person responsible for the crime. Forensic science in France. In 1996, near the turn of the century, France was far behind in genetic engineering, compared of course to the United Kingdom, the United States, and many other countries. The French police did not systematically use DNA to identify victims or suspects, and there was no criminal database that could be consulted in cases like this. I keep thinking, these days there are still a lot of crimes like this that end up unsolved. Even though we have connected databases and all that today, can you imagine back in a time when none of that existed? In that situation, with no security cameras or DNA databases? Man, it must have been a scary thing, right? Well, at that time, a source connected to the investigation stated the following. Our investigative tradition is less rooted in scientific evidence than the British one. and there is a kind of innate suspicion of science among the French intellectual classes. Of course, guys, I don't need to say it, but today, those French people who said that would obviously be labeled as deniers, conspiracy theorists, taxi drivers, taxidermists, and so on. But look, if the investigation isn't based on scientific evidence, guys, what is it going to be based on? On witnesses who can be mistaken and often are. This all depends on the skill and dexterity of the person conducting the police interview. A single word someone uses, a suggestion they make, can completely shift the focus. So, witnesses, obviously, are fundamental. They're actually indispensable in a trial or an investigation. But what else? The investigator's instinct, right? You can't really give it much credibility, right? What a completely out of context, unfortunate statement, right? A tremendous shot in the foot. John Dickinson. And here, our congratulations to Mr. John Dickinson, the father. Because it was his determination that was there helping the public prosecutor and the British government with massive media coverage, which forced the French judiciary to invest resources in the hunt for the killer of the British girl. Thus, the first chief investigator assigned to the case was replaced, and the investigation expanded and crossed borders, reaching several European countries. At the end of that work, 3,600 DNA samples were collected and 10,000 people were interviewed. And let's consider here that the odds pointed to a repeat offender, an experienced criminal who might have already had a police record. In other words, it would mean gathering data from similar cases and cross-referencing those names with residents, workers, or men who were traveling in France on the date of the crime. Hotel guests, inns, credit card expenses, possible traffic fines, and so on. People who acted unusually on the crime day. Anyway, guys, it's a basic process that requires a lot of effort and needs to be done in a way that's well done. But that's what's needed in an investigation, right? Well, it was painstaking work where we needed to reduce the number of suspects to be subjected to police interrogations, right? Lie detector and DNA tests. And remember, we're not specialists here. But a test with the sequencing of the entire DNA, like the ones done in paternity tests, for example, nowadays, can take up to 2 weeks. In other words, it would take a long time for the answers to come. Well, back in 1998, the French Parliament approved the proposal to create a DNA database. 2 years later, in 2000, then President Jacques Chirac issued a decree about it. And later, the laws were expanded, allowing the registration of DNA from people suspected of sexual crimes punishable by 3 years in prison. So, when checking reports of assaults in youth hostels across France, the head of the investigation drew up a list of 100 suspects. And a certain Francisco Arce Montes was among them, a Spaniard described as a drifter who sometimes worked as a waiter. And this guy was suspected of several attacks on girls, not only in Europe, but also in North America. And as you may remember, I just mentioned the delays in forensic science, right? However, the sources mention several other problems in this investigation. For example, issues involving the International Police Organization, Interpol staff, and not the French and British police officers. The Spanish police also failed when they didn't immediately report that Francisco Arce Montes had a conviction for abuse back in his country. Because of this, and with all these difficulties mentioned, his capture in 2001 was a coincidence. That's right. And it only happened because a United States immigration officer read an article in a British newspaper at the Detroit airport, naming Arce Montes as wanted for questioning. So just to be sure, he searched the name in the immigration databases and found out that the Spanish man with a criminal record was being held in Miami on charges of obscene behavior. Years later, when he was tried, it was revealed that when he was arrested at the hostel in Miami Beach, Florida, He had a small silver pair of scissors that he used to cut the underwear of his victims while they slept. He was extradited to France to answer for the attack and murder of Caroline. But he had other frightening stories to his name, including an assault committed in Spain in 1997, where the victim was also a girl at a resort or holiday camp. It's also worth mentioning that he had been questioned by the French police 2 years before being arrested in 2011 when he tried to kidnap an Irish student. And this case was tremendously frightening, and the one who reported the events was Alan Jacques, the victim's brother. It all started when the Spanish abuser saw the 14-year-old Irish girl on a school trip in Paris, precisely when Valérie Jacques was having a picnic with friends. Obsessed with the girl like a complete lunatic, Francisco Arquemontes followed the students to the city of Blair, a 209-kilometer trip to the hotel in the Loire Valley where the students were staying. That's right, abducted. Valerie went to sleep that night and woke up around 2:30 in the morning when she heard a man calling her name. He had searched through her bags and found her notebooks where her name was written. First, he spoke in French, but then he asked in English if she could come out and help him fix the car. She realized that there was something terribly wrong about it and screamed. There were 5 other girls sleeping in the room, and then he ran out. The teachers and the hotel staff were informed, and on the following night, since there was no lock on the door, the girls locked themselves inside the room, blocking the door with a dresser. They did this as a formality since no one believed that he, the unknown intruder, would come back. But guess what? That's right, he came back. At 2:30 in the morning, Valerie heard the brazen scoundrel once again pushing the door and calling her name. She ran to the farthest corner of the room, and the other girls woke up and then called the police. Later, they asked her to identify him. She said she couldn't recognize his face because it was dark, but she recognized the scoundrel's voice. Francisco Arcemontes was detained and identified by Valerie, but then he was released with a warning. Can you believe it? A 14-year-old girl harassed 2 nights in a row by a crazy stranger. And he just walks away like that. Free as a bird, just with a warning. It's pretty bizarre, isn't it? Imagine the terror that girl has felt since then. Years went by until she saw the ugly face of that pervert plastered on television. Related to the Caroline Dickinson case, Valérie Jacques instantly recognized the modus operandi of that evil man who tried to kidnap her and do even worse things to her. She and her family then immediately contacted the police and reported all the events I just told you about here. Naturally, that counted against him at trial. Trial and conviction. Guys, before we get into the trial and the conviction, I just need to make a disclaimer here. My voice is terribly hoarse. It probably sounds nasal since I'm still getting over a cold. I'm kind of deaf too, okay? It's a real treat today, but let's keep going, right? Just in case anyone happens to find the narration strange. But forgive me, that's what we've got for today. Deal? Well, when he was arrested, Francisco Montes told investigators that he had a miserable childhood as the only child of middle-class parents who ran a corner grocery store. During his teenage years, he became obsessed with his personal hygiene and started showing behaviors typical of obsessive-compulsive disorder. At the age of 20, he exposed himself and harassed a neighbor, which finally led to a diagnosis of depression and progressive schizophrenia. 8 years after the crime, on June 14, 2004, Francisco Arcemontes was tried and sentenced to 30 years in prison for the abuse and murder of Caroline N. Dickinson. A civil hearing was also held after the verdict, where the defendant was ordered to pay 100,000 euros to the Dickinson family and also court costs of 15,000 euros. But the scoundrel in his early 50s could be released on parole after serving a third of his sentence, even though the prosecution had requested a life sentence for him, with a minimum of 25 years of mandatory imprisonment. It is also reported that his defense filed an appeal to explain himself and tell the truth, in quotes, to Caroline's family. Because the criminal wanted to claim that the girl's death was an accident. The real accident was the birth of that son of a bitch. According to his version, he covered Caroline Dickinson's mouth with cotton so the teenager wouldn't scream while he abused her, but he claims he never intended to kill her. Man, what a disgusting person, right? To find a teenager alone in her room, abuse her, and then say her death was an accident. Man, do people ever put themselves in someone else's shoes? Anyway, just thinking out loud here, well, he also said that he understood the pain and the desire of the family members for Caroline to be with them today. So, he just wanted to say that his actions were horrible but not premeditated. He just wanted her not to scream. In short, in quotes, I did something horrible. I accept, but I want to have the opportunity to one day have a normal life. Please don't let me die in prison. The sources say, folks, that for him, the way he saw himself, he was like some kind of untouchable Superman under the influence of whiskey and antidepressants, and that the silent desecration of sleeping girls could always be explained as an honest mistake, in quotes. And it's certain that he acted this way for more than 30 years, his entire adult life, between 1974 and 2011. A few minutes after the verdict was delivered, Mr. Dickinson, the victim's father, stood on the courthouse steps and said he wanted to thank on behalf of himself, his wife, and his daughter, because after 8 years of seeking justice, they were seeing it happen. According to Caroline's father, there were moments when he felt down and powerless, but he never felt like giving up. He also expressed a lot of gratitude to the family's supporters and acknowledged that there were other victims who were generous to Caroline by giving testimony at the trial. Other girls and their families also deserved justice. Caroline's sister added the following: everything was for Caroline. Although her life was short, she was happy and had a future full of promise ahead of her. We have some wonderful memories that we will cherish, and she will never be forgotten. The writer Winsley Clarkson gave an account of the life of Francisco Arce Montes, from his first attack on a girl who ended up having a child by him, to his transcontinental reign of terror. He is called the Wolf Man, a rejected loner with an addiction to hurting girls. According to the author, Francisco has the blood of other victims on his hands. And because of all that, wouldn't it be best if he never had the chance to get out of prison? Because it's only a matter of time before he does it all over again, if he gets the chance. I don't know how old he is today, but scumbags. Don't age in the sense of withering the desire to do the wrong thing that's inside his soul. The body might, but the mind... There are plenty of cases out there that prove I'm not lying about this. Then this guy gets out because a loophole lets him serve just a third of his sentence. And he commits an atrocity like that again. I keep wondering, is the blood only on his hands? Yeah, the comments section is open for us to talk about this case, or cases. Thank you so much for your company. A kiss from the redhead. See you in the next episode.